Most people today think that the Catholic Church's teaching on contraception is outdated, maybe even oppressive. And even many Catholics don't understand why the church teaches what it does on contraception. That is why in this video, we will discuss what the church teaches on contraception, why this is in line with natural philosophy and reason, and even what scientific studies say are some of the very negative consequences of using, for example, hormonal artificial contraception. And this is part of a larger video series I'm doing on the teachings of the Catholic Church in regards to sexual ethics. So if you're interested in that subject, then feel free to subscribe and like this video so that YouTube will recommend future videos for you. And over at Patreon, you'll also get more direct access to me. If you have any questions, I'm there to help. Now, in the previous video in this series, I talked about how the Catholic Church has always taught that sex has two purposes, unitive and procreative. So they are meant to unite a married couple. And my camera died. Let me plug it in and try that again. Okay, should be good. Very professional as always, of course. Okay, what was I saying? So, like I said in the previous video in this series, I mentioned how the Catholic Church has always taught there are two purposes of sex, the unitive and the procreative. So sex is meant to unite a married couple more fully and to be open to the creation of new life. And as we're going to see in this series, every sexual sin is essentially trying to separate one of these purposes from the other. Typically, we're trying to use it for just pleasure or something like that, and keep it apart from the either unitive or procreative aspect. So for example, things like watching filth on the internet, to use a phrase that will be less likely to get me demonetized, or, having many different partners who you're not, seriously considering being united with for the rest of your life. Any of these things are meant to separate both the unitive and the procreative aspect from the act itself, merely just using it for your own personal pleasure. Whereas contraception, which we're talking about today, is separating maybe even the unitive aspect, because you might be married and using contraception, which the church is still against, because you are separating the act itself from its procreative aspect intentionally. And the reason that matters is that contraception is separating the sexual act from what it is intentionally designed for. And even if you're not a religious person, if you just look at this from a scientific perspective, go into any biology textbook, you'll see that the purpose of sex is, at least in part, for the creation of new life, to continue the species. And so to act against that original design, or you might say evolutionary purpose of sex, is to go against the natural law, to go against the natural order, to go against the way things are naturally oriented. To use an analogy that might sound a bit silly, but will get our point across a little more clearly, maybe is, let's say it became very fashionable, or maybe it felt really good to cause your ears to go deaf. I know it sounds ridiculous, just go with me. Let's just say that was a trend that people were doing. It would be a violation against the natural order to do that, because our ears are naturally oriented towards hearing things. And whether or not we want to hear things, if we artificially cause ourselves to not hear things and mutilate our bodies to do so, perhaps, that is a violation against the natural order, and therefore against the one who has instituted the natural order, which is God. And so in the same way, to render our body parts which are oriented towards the creation of new life incapable of producing new life, either temporarily or permanently, that is a violation against the natural order, and therefore against the one who has instituted that natural order, which is God. And so that is essentially, in a nutshell, why the church teaches what it does about contraception. But let's look a little bit deeper into some of the church's documents themselves so we can get a clear answer on this. So the clearest explanation of this teaching comes to us from a document called Humanae Vitae, which was produced, I believe, shortly after the Second Vatican Council. So around the 1960s, I believe, and this was Pope Paul VI, if I'm not mistaken. Let me make sure that that's true. Yes, Pope Paul VI. So this was produced by Pope Paul VI, or at least under his pontificate. And it says here in section 12, I recommend reading this whole document. It's absolutely beautiful. But in section 12, it says, this particular doctrine, often expounded by the magisterium of the church, is based on the inseparable connection established by God, which man on his own initiative may not break, between the unitive significance and the procreative significance, which are both inherent to the marriage act. So there you go. That's basically what we've been saying in this video. The reason is that the fundamental nature of the marriage act, while uniting husband and wife in the closest intimacy, also renders them capable of generating new life, and this as a result of laws written into the actual nature of man and of woman. And if each of these essential qualities, the unitive and the procreative, is preserved, the use of marriage fully retains its sense of true mutual love and its ordination to the supreme responsibility of parenthood to which man is called, We believe that our contemporaries are particularly capable of seeing that this teaching is in harmony with human reason. And hopefully, I've shown earlier in this video that this is in harmony with human reason. Another line of reasoning I've heard people use is that if the marital act is the act of giving yourself fully to your spouse, then how can you say you are actually giving yourself fully to your spouse if you are withholding your fertility? I think that's a pretty strong argument, or actually against contraception. But you might say, what about if, what if there are situations where, for example, the couple is incapable of conceiving new children, either because the man is infertile or the woman is infertile? Well, this document also touches on that subject. So in section 11, just before the section we just read, this is titled Observing the Natural Law. It says, the sexual activity in which husband and wife are intimately and chastely united with one another, through which human life is transmitted, is, as the recent council recalled, noble and worthy. It does not, moreover, cease to be legitimate even when, for reasons independent of their will, it is foreseen to be infertile. For its natural adaptation to the expression and strengthening of the union of husband and wife is not thereby suppressed. The fact is, as experience shows, that new life is not the result of each and every act of sexual intercourse. God has wisely ordered laws of nature and the incidence of fertility in such a way that successive births are already naturally spaced through the inherent operation of these laws. The Church, nevertheless, in urging men to the observance of the precepts of the natural law, which interprets by its constant doctrine, teaches that each and every marital act must, of necessity, retain its intrinsic relationship to the procreation of human life. So I've heard people argue, well, then wouldn't this mean that anybody who is, for example, past the age of being able to bear children, if they have sex, is that like a sin or something because they can't possibly create new life? And no, because it is not them acting deliberately to prevent the creation of new life. It is just a consequence of natural aging. And therefore, it's not a sin to still engage in that act because you're not separating it deliberately from its procreative aspect, nor its unitive aspect within a marriage, but it is just a consequence of your age that is the case. So it has to do with your will. Are you trying to play God in choosing when and when not to have a new child? Or is it just a matter of natural biology in the way that God has ordered things, or at least after the fall, that it is impossible to bear new life after this age? If it is, then the act is still valid for the unitive aspect of it within your marriage. Again, I highly recommend going and reading Humanae Vitae for yourself. It is a beautifully written document, as pretty much every document by the church is, and it explains these things in a lot of depth, and in much more depth than we're going to be able to get to here. Also, for even more reading on the sexual ethics of the church as a whole, which is going to cover everything that we're about to cover in this series, I highly recommend going to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. It's a book that looks like this, or there are other versions of it. There's also online resources where you can access it for free. But I recommend reading paragraphs 2331 through 2400. Those paragraphs cover almost all of the sexual ethics that the church teaches in a lot of detail and in a lot of beauty and depth. So I highly recommend going and checking that out. But now let's talk about some of the scientific findings of the effects of birth control on women, on relationships, and even on the wider ecosystem. So it turns out that contraception actually, especially hormonal contraception, has a lot of negative impacts on women who take it. So this is from the JAMA, which I can't really remember what it stands for. I think it's the Journal of American Medical Association or something like that. So they have an article titled Contraception, Selection, Effectiveness, and Adverse Effects. And we're not going to read the whole thing, but there's an important quote here where it says, estrogen-containing methods such as combined oral contraceptive pills increase the risk of venous thrombosis from 2 to 10 venous thrombotic events per 10,000 women, years to 7 to 10 venous thrombotic events for per 10,000 women years. So a lot of confusing language, but here's essentially what that means. So a venous thrombotic event, which is just a crazy sounding word, it means a blood clot. So it increases your chances of having a blood clot from 2 to 10 to 7 to 10. So a pretty huge increase in the likelihood of a blood clot. Now, still, the chances seem to be fairly low, but there are even other examples of increased risks when taking contraception. For example, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists has this article titled Hormonal Contraception and Risk of Breast Cancer, which, as you might expect, is about how hormonal contraception increases the risk of breast cancer. So let's see what they say. So while this article tries to undermine or minimize the risks that they found, they still affirm that there is an increased risk when it comes to taking, especially progestin, which is a hormone that is often used in birth control, and an increased risk in breast cancer, rather. So they say meta-analyses of these studies have shown a slight increased risk ranging from 8 to 24%. So that is the increased risk of breast cancer when using birth control, which is similar to the risk observed in the current study. But they still try to minimize it and say, yeah, but the overall risk is still low. But if you were told, hey, taking this might increase your risk of breast cancer by 24%, that's kind of concerning, isn't it? I think that's something to consider. And this article by the National Cancer Institute reiterates those concerns and also notes the a 7 to 24% risk increase in risk of breast cancer for those using contraception. So I'm going to leave all the links to everything that I cite in this video in the description. If I forget, then make sure to comment and remind me, because that does happen sometimes. But aside from an increased risk in breast cancer and other cancers, UCLA Health says in their psychiatry department, study shows how birth control pills affect women's psychological and biological responses to stress. So they explain here, a new UCLA Health study is shedding light on how using hormonal contraceptive pills may affect women's responses to stress and their risk for inflammation-related illnesses. The study, published in the journal Brain Behavior and Immunity, is the first to directly measure differences in hormonal contraceptive users and non-users' psychological and immune responses to socially stressful situations. And it's kind of funny how they did this study, actually, the way they structured it. So they say researchers at the UCLA Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences Laboratory for Stress Assessment and Research found contraceptive users and non-users process stress differently at the molecular level, with contraceptive users also reporting a more negative psychological response to stress compared to non-users. So it seems like women who are on hormonal birth control are more susceptible to stress and have heightened levels of stress in similar situations than those who are not taking those hormonal birth controls. So the way they did this was, let me find where they describe it, because it's kind of funny. All right, so in the study, nearly 130 women, 60 using hormonal contraceptive pills and 67 being naturally cycling or free from hormonal contraceptive use, provided researchers a saliva sample and then rated their mood and stress levels. Each participant then underwent a stress test in which they gave a 5-minute speech about their dream job to a stone-faced researcher who did not react or provide positive affirmation. Following this speech, the participant was surprised with a mental task in which they had to count backwards from 1022 in intervals of 13 for 5 minutes. That sounds stressful. I would be stressed out. If the participant made a mistake, they were told to start again. Following the test, participants provided a second saliva sample, as well as rated their mood and stress levels. I would be very irritated and stressed out. So what did they find? Researchers found that women who used contraceptives had higher levels of an inflammatory cytokine called TNF-alpha, both before and after the stress test. Mengokok, I'm not going to pronounce that right, said the cytokine may be associated with a more male-typical response to stress. In comparison, naturally cycling women had a more female-typical response to stress, with higher levels of the cytokine known as interleukin-6, rising alongside increases in cortisol. So they say here, the findings also found that women who use contraceptives reported a more negative emotional response to stress as their levels of cortisol, a steroid hormone that works to reduce inflammation, rose, which is unusual. So they explain, cortisol gets a bad rap, but increases of cortisol in response to stress help the body manage stressful situations. If women on the pill are having these increases in cortisol, but their mood is getting worse, it could mean that the pill is preventing their bodies and minds from returning to normal following stress. That is very concerning. That is not good. So far we have birth control affecting, increasing risk of cancer, affecting how you handle stress. And now we see there's a study here on the influence of contraception, abortion, and natural family planning on divorce rates, as found in the 2006 to 2010 National Survey of Family Growth. So this study was to evaluate the effects of using different forms of birth control or using abortion on divorce rates. And they found here, providers of natural family planning, or NFP, frequently mention that couples who practice NFP have fewer divorces compared to couples who use contraception. And they go on to give solid numbers. So they say among the women participants who ever used NFP, only 9.6% were currently divorced, compared with the 14.4% who use methods of contraception, sterilization, or abortion as a family planning method. And this is also associated with frequency of church attendance. So, yeah, of course, if you're attending church, if you're more religious, you're way less likely to get divorced. And also, if you're religious, you're more likely to practice things like NFP rather than birth control. So, it turns out that birth control is associated with increased risk of cancer, a worse reaction to stress, higher levels of divorce, among other negative outcomes. And you might be wondering at this point, what is NFP? What are you talking about? Well, I'm going to leave an article in the description here that is another scientific article titled Natural Family Planning, Effective Birth Control Supported by the Catholic Church. So this is, in short, a method of family planning by which you use the natural cycles of the woman's ovulation to know when is she less fertile, less likely to conceive, and then you can engage in the marital act in those periods of time rather than using artificial birth control while still working with the natural design of our bodies and our systems and all that good stuff. And maybe the worst part of all of this is how not only this is affecting women themselves, but how it's affecting the ecosystem as a whole. Because if you think about it, women who are taking these hormonal birth control pills are then, urinating into the streams, and that is getting into water supplies and lakes and the like. So there are studies on this as well and how it affects animals and humans. So this article is titled Endocrine Disruptors in Water and Their Effects on the Reproductive System. And in the abstract, they say here in the first sentence, anthropogenic contaminants in water can impose risk to reproductive health. Most of these compounds are known to be endocrine disrupting chemicals. EDCs can impact the endocrine system and subsequently impair the development and fertility of non-human animals and humans. They say the source of chemical contamination in water is diverse, originated from byproducts formed during water disinfection processes, released from industry and livestock activity, or therapeutic drugs released into sewage. And in this review, they discuss the occurrence of EDCs in water, such as disinfection byproducts, fluorinated compounds, bisphenol A, phthalates, pesticides, and estrogens. And it outlines their adverse reproductive effects in non-human animals and humans. So I will leave a link to this in the description for your further reading. But let's just say it's not great. And this reiterates those concerns. So this is another study from the IISD, which is some other organization that I'm not familiar with, but I'll leave a link to this in the description as well. And this says, new study finds estrogen has detrimental and surprising effects on freshwater wildlife. So they say in the subtitle here, the International Institute for Sustainable Development, which I guess is what that stands for, and the University of New Brunswick today released the findings of a study that show that the birth control pill has unexpected effects on aquatic ecosystems. And I believe there were even some concerns about wildlife going extinct because of these types of hormonal disruptors that are being put into lakes and such as a result of birth control. So they start off here, the International Institute for Sustainable Development Experimental Lakes Area and the University of New Brunswick today released the findings of a study that showed that the birth control pill has unexpected effects on aquatic ecosystems. The study, published in the most recent issue of a prestigious British science journal, found that introducing synthetic estrogen found in the birth control pill into a lake negatively affected their reproductive cycles of fathead minnow and led to a near extinction of the population. The estrogen interfered with the minnow's ability to reproduce. And we can also just guess at what that effect might be on humans who are drinking water from supplies that are being, passed through these systems from lakes and from whatever. That can't be great. That can't be great for us. So that is a problem. That has been a long-time concern of ecologists, and it should be a long-time concern for all of us. So we've seen in this video how not only is artificial birth control against the natural order of things, whether you're religious or not, that just is reasonable to believe. The negative effects that it has on women, whether that be an increased risk of cancer, a worse reaction to stress, lower or higher divorce rates among married couples who use contraception and the like. And we also see how it's bad for the ecosystems that it affects. The mass use of hormone-based birth control pills is affecting the ecosystems because that is being passed through the urine into waterways, into lakes, and that is affecting wildlife that live in those lakes or that drink from those lakes. It's not good. Now, as always, as I said in my last video, none of this is meant to be judgmental or to point fingers at you and make you feel bad for your decisions in life. That is not the goal. The goal here is to explain what the Catholic Church teaches on a subject, why that is in line with natural philosophy and reason, and also how that aligns with what we see in the natural world. if it is true that it is against my camera died again. Very professional. Okay, we're back. So, like I was saying, the purpose of this is to show that not only are the teachings of the church when it comes to sexual ethics true according to human reason and philosophy and good when applied to our personal lives, but they're also just in line with science. Like they're also just in line with what does the science say is best for your life, for your health, for your happiness, for the success of your relationships. And that is always, at least as far as I've seen so far, and we'll see if that changes throughout the course of this series, but that seems to always be in line with what the church teaches. So the church teaches X, and then if you do X, it turns out you're going to have a better life and be happier. And even if you do X, it's going to be better for the ecosystem around you and for the people around you. You're going to be better to the people around you and to the world around you if you follow the teachings of the Catholic Church. That is the purpose of this series. That is the purpose of this video, not to make people feel bad. I'm guilty of probably almost everything I'm going to say is wrong in this series. I've done almost all of it. So if anybody should feel bad, it's me. And that is not what I'm trying to do here. So don't get the wrong idea. If, like I said, you want to do more reading on these subjects, all the links will be in the description. I highly recommend picking up one of these. The Catechism of the Catholic Church has everything you would ever want to know about anything in this book, and it's absolutely wonderfully written and just beautifully done. So, with all of that said, I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you for bearing with some of the technical difficulties of the camera dying and such. We got through it, and hopefully this has been beneficial to you. If you know somebody who struggles with these teachings of the church, maybe they are a Catholic, but they kind of don't understand these teachings, or maybe they're not a Catholic because they reject these teachings, send them this video. Hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully this is presented in a way that is digestible for people who even don't agree with these teachings, so that they can at least further understand why we believe what we believe on these matters. Otherwise, if you would like to support the channel, you can do so at patreon.com/sipswithsarah, which will be linked in the description and in the pinned comment. You can also support for free by just liking this video and subscribing to the channel. That helps out a ton. You have no idea how helpful that is. So thank you so much to everybody who is already supporting and subscribing and has already liked the video. And until I see you next time, God bless and cheers. And I promise I will charge my camera next time so that that doesn't happen again.